Greetings, my name is Kerry and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm filming my April wrap up. I am not quite sure how we have reached May already this year. It seems to be going very quickly, but never mind. I read a total of 8 books in April, which wasn't bad. Actually, it was a really good reading month because the lowest rating I gave was 3 stars and that was only 1 book. So I had 1 3-star book, 4 4-star books and 3 5-star books. That's a really good reading month really. 2 books were from my owned TBR. 3 were books that I bought this year or gained this year. 1 was given to me. 2 were books that I borrowed and 1 was a reread. In terms of the types of books, they were mainly fiction, but there was 1 non-fiction book and 1 book of poetry. And for my reading challenges for this year, 1 book counted towards my Read Around the World challenge, and that was for Nepal. 3 books were from the Indie challenge and 1 book was from the oldest books on my TBR. So without further ado, let's get into the books. I'm going to start as usual with my least favourite book of the month. This was a book I gave 3 stars to. This was The House on Rosebank Lane by Millie Gray. This book was sent to me free by the publisher in exchange for my honest review, so you can go and check that review out if you want to know more of my thoughts on it. It was alright. It's not one I'll reread. I probably won't be rushing out to buy all of Millie Gray's back catalogue, but I quite liked it. It's the family saga. It's set sort of starting in the 50s, 1950s through to sort of the 1970s, set in Edinburgh. Follows the main character, who is called Kirsten, and her life and her trials and tribulations, and it's kind of a bit of a soap opera in a book, but it wasn't, you know, I didn't hate it. It wasn't all bad. I enjoyed it more than I was expecting to, hence the 3-star rating. And as I say, if you want to know more of my thoughts, go and check out my review on that. This one counted towards the indie challenge because the publisher, Black and White Publishers, are a indie publisher, so I used this to tick off genre fiction because it's a family saga. New to you press because it was the first book I'd read from Black and White Publishing. It's a press over 20 years old and it was out of my comfort zone because I don't often read this type of book. So that was my only 3-star read of the month. So onto my 4-star reads. I'm going to start with my Agatha Christie reads this month. The first Agatha Christie for Mission Marple that I read this month was They Do It With Mirrors, so I have got a little bit behind on Mission Marple. I think I'm nearly about to catch up though. This one I read right at the beginning of the month, so I don't remember it really well, but I remember it being quite enjoyable. And it's one that's set in a large country house again, which I quite like that trope when she does that, meeting all the different family members. Oh yeah, I do remember this one. I found very interesting because the main character, although she spells it differently, is called Carrie Louise, which if my American friend Carrie was saying that name, she'd say it exactly the same way she says my name, which is Carrie Louise, obviously. So it really was, I mean, that's the closest I've ever got to having my name in a book. So the central character is called Carrie Louise, and she's an old school friend of Miss Marple, and her sister's worried about her, so sends Miss Marple to go and sort of try and find out what's going on in the house. Then there are a couple of murders. I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was very clever, the outworking of it. I figured out some of it, again, as I often do with Agatha Christie, but I'm never quite clever enough to get the whole story. But I quite enjoyed this one on the whole. So that was They Do It With Mirrors. I also read, but I read it from my omnibus, so I'm not counting it towards my... I also read A Pocketful of Rye, which is in this omnibus edition. So again, this was another fairly standard Miss Marple mystery. I quite like the setup of it because the murder appears to happen at a different time to what it actually happens, and it was all to do with poisoning, and I thought it was very clever. I also liked the setup for Miss Marple getting involved in this one because it was a bit different. So there's a second murder who is someone that Miss Marple used to be acquainted with, and when she reads about it in the paper she feels that she has to come and give her views because she knows the second person that was murdered. And I thought it was very clever how that was set up and how the police just go along with it. Like Miss Marple just turns up and starts having her input. So I really enjoyed that one too, and if it had been an individual edition it would have been a 4-star read as well. So those were the 2 Marple books that I read in April. The next 4-star read of the month was The Chosen Ones by Scarlett Thomas. This is the second book in the Worldquake series. It had been a little while since I'd read the first one, so I was a bit rusty when I first started reading it on trying to remember what had happened in the first one, but this was a really good follow-up, and it actually did, once I got into it, I was like, oh yeah, no, I do remember the first book. So the premise of these books is that there's been this big event called the Worldquake, which has disrupted everything and has made everything really different to how it was before. So it's sort of slightly post-apocalyptic, but it's not like really bad, not to the extent of some dystopian novels. So things like technology doesn't always work properly. They have like sort of basic phone communication, but not like smartphones or anything like that. The internet doesn't really work anymore. But there's also this other world called the Other World, where things work differently, time works differently, and there's magic. And then there's also the underworld, which we sort of touched on in this book, but we don't really know very much about it yet, apart from only dark magicians can go there. And the story centres around these 5 children who are close friends. Are sort of teenagers, they're around sort of 11, 12, 13 years old. So we've got Effie, Truelove, who's the main character, Maximilian, Raven, Lexi and Wolf. They all became friends in the first book. They weren't really friends before that. And they each have a sort of a special power. So you have sort of a main power and then a secondary and a third power. So Effie is a true hero. Maximilian, I think, is a mage, and like is a really complex magic system, but it's really well explained because these are middle grade, these are aimed at children the same age as the characters, and they're very clever. And the other sort of aspect of it is that one thing that gives you power in this world, in both in the real world and in the other world and in the underworld I think as well, is reading. So there's a lot of power with being the last person to read a particular book. So this sort of premise of this plot is that a dark mage, an evil magician, is trying to destroy every single copy ever of a really popular book apart from this one special edition she's had made, and once she's destroyed all the other copies she'll become the last reader of this really well loved book, and then she'll absorb all the power from it. Effie and her friends are trying to prevent this from happening. So they're quite complex stories, but I really love them. I have the third one as well, which has just came out in April. It's called Gallow Glass, so I'm looking forward to reading that soon. I wanted to read this one before Gallow Glass arrived, and I was sort of reading it when Gallow Glass arrived, so I'm going to be able to move on to Gallow Glass soon and catch up on this series. The chosen ones also was for my indie challenge, so I used this for genre fiction because it is urban fantasy, a book from a series. It's a book from my TBR and it's kids or YA, and it was recommended by a friend because Bex from Ninja Book Box raves about these books. She really loves them. The next book I gave 4 stars to was The Air I Breathe by Louie Giglio. So this is sort of a Christian lifestyle book. It's about worship and how everyone in the world worships something, whether that's God or money or pop music or, you know, various different things. But we all gear our lives towards adoration of something or someone. So it's about as a Christian, having an attitude of turning everything to work towards worshipping God. I did quite enjoy it. It was kind of maybe a little bit basic for what I usually read in terms of Christian literature, but I found it quite useful as a way of putting things simply, because one of the things I'm involved with at church is a band for some of the teenagers in the church, so this is something that I can foresee using in the future with them, sort of teach them a bit more about how we can use music and other aspects of our lives to honour God with our lives. And this was one of the oldest books on my TBR, so that was good too. Okay, so the next book that I finished in April was Dune by Frank Herbert. You may remember me talking about this. Initially I picked this up in February for Feb Junary, which I was doing with some booktube friends who were meant to be buddy reading it. Only one person actually managed to finish the book in February, and my problem was I have this really hefty omnibus edition of the first 3 books, so I was finding it really difficult to carry it around, and I struggled to get into it to start with. But I really wanted to finish it because I have the whole series that my dad gave me, and I know it was really popular epic sci-fi, so I really wanted to finish it to see if I wanted to read the rest of the series. So in the end I got a copy out from the library of just the first book so that it was a bit more portable, and then actually once I got stuck into it I really did enjoy it a lot more than I was expecting to. And part of that was, so it's a science fiction novel written in the 60s, but to me it felt more like fantasy, and sort of once I'd figured out and tried to read it more as science fantasy than pure science fiction, I enjoyed it a lot more. Part of the reason for that redefining in my head was that there's a lot about politics. It's about sort of warring between different dukes over this planet Arrakis and who's going to run this planet, and then the son of one of the dukes is sort of becomes this quite mythological figure, and there's like little quote introductions to each section that are about this lad who's a teenager when the book starts. The other reason why it felt more like fantasy to me was because there's this real focus on extrasensory perception and sort of mind control, and people being able to sort of have quite computer-like abilities with mind and also use their mind and their voice to control others and have sort of visions and things like that. And it's all a bit weird and sounds a bit like magic, which is why it feels more like fantasy. Although when I was thinking about it, I remember talking to my dad about an episode of the original series of Star Trek, which was really focused on extrasensory perception. And at the time that the Dune books were written, as well as at the time that the first series ever of Star Trek was made, that was quite a scientific idea, and it's only sort of been debunked more recently, like in the later part of the 20th century. Once I'd sort of got my head around actually that was more of a magic system than a scientific process and all of that, then I actually started to enjoy the book a lot more, and the pace really picked up. The first sort of third of the book was quite slow paced, but then it picked up a lot more towards the end. So I really enjoyed it. I am going to carry on with the series, but I'm going to try and get the second book out from the library. I've done all of them. That was all my 4-star reads. Okay, so on to my 5-star reads, and the first book that I gave 5 stars to this month was another library book, and this was The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. Hopefully I'm saying that right. This book was one that I picked up because it was a group book for Blackathon back in February, and I had to wait for it to come in at the library. So I read it pretty much straight away when it came in at the library, and I loved it. It's written in verse. The main character, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, writes poetry. She loves slam poetry, and so the whole book is told from her perspective in poetry form, and I really related to a lot of it, even though it's about a black Latinx character in America. Hopefully I remember that correctly, because I don't have the book with me because it was from the library. She talks a lot about her mother is Catholic, very strong faith Catholic, and there's quite a lot about the sort of idea of purity culture of girls' bodies and what girls wear being distracting to men, and that being a problem because of the girls being the problem, not the men that are attracted to them that lust after them. And that's sort of a culture that I grew up in as well, white evangelical middle class church circles. So there was a lot that I found to relate to, even though it's sort of a very different culture, and sort of that's what I love about reading, really, is that you can have situations and characters that are very far removed from your own experience that still experience very similar things to you, and that's why reading is so powerful, because it really grows our empathy, because we understand people in a better way. So I can't think of anything more to say about that, but I really do highly recommend that book. If you haven't read it, go and check it out. It is fantastic, it's beautiful, and I am going to be looking out for other books by the author, because I really engaged with that and I really enjoyed that book. The next book that I gave 5 stars to was a very short one. It's a little chat book called Night. This is from the Translating Feminism series. So the author is Sulochana Manadhar and the translator is Muna Gurung. So this was translated from Nepalese. I actually got this in a Kickstarter campaign to produce 3 poetry chapbooks of translated poems from Asian cultures, and I really loved this. In the past I would have worried that poetry doesn't translate very well, but this was just so beautiful. The poems are very simple, very straightforward, but they're just so lovely, and I've just found them really beautiful, and I'm so glad that I supported this Kickstarter, because otherwise I wouldn't have come across these poems. And I've actually got 3 others, because they produced a 4th one as a thank you to their Kickstarter supporters. So I've got 3 more in this series to read with poems from different cultures, different countries. So I'm very much looking forward to reading those. This also counted towards my indie challenge. It was author from another country, a crowd-funded book, a new to press, a poetry collection and a translated book. It also counted towards my Read Around the World challenge because it's Nepal. And then finally, the final book that I read this month, the final book that I gave 5 stars to, was my reread. So this was The Secrets of Jin-Shei by Alma Alexander. I've sort of been loosely planning this year to take part in the Rereadathon, which is a year-long readathon with a different prompt each month, and I kept forgetting, and then I remembered this month. So this month's prompt for it was a book set in a different culture or world, and this one is set in a place called Sai, or Sai. I'm not quite sure how you're meant to pronounce it, and it is a made up place, but it's loosely based on medieval China. the story centres on this group of women who become connected by the Jin-Shei sisterhood. So Jin Ashu is the female language, so it's a language that is shared between women and men don't read it. Part of that is something called the Jin-Shei sisterhood, so women can choose to become sisters with their friends or women they're not related to, and that is a bond that is meant to be stronger than blood sisterhood. It's centred around this group of women who have chosen this bond. I first read it quite a while ago because I have the second book, which I bought not knowing it was a sequel, and it's kind of only loosely a sequel, but I do think you have to read them in order. So when I realised that it was a sequel, I bought this one and I read it and then never got around to reading the second one. So I'm going to read the second one soon, now that I've reread this one. It's always a worry reading books that you remember loving, because what if they don't hold up, what if they're not as good? But this one was. I really loved it. I remembered bits of the story and other bits came back to me as it was going along. There's sort of a few magical elements in there. There's some really badass women who don't take no nonsense, and they just really stick up for each other. And one of my favourite ever characters in literature is in here. She's called Tai. She's one of the central characters, and she's just a character that I really relate to. But yeah, I'm looking forward to now picking up the second one, and now that I remember what happens in the first one. Oh, and I was also going to say about this one, although it doesn't have dragons in it, if you enjoyed Priory of the Orange Tree, I would say check out this book. I think if you liked that book, I think you'll like this one. That's my hot recommendation for you. So what I'm currently reading at the moment, I have a few books on the go. So at the moment I've just picked up Ruin and Rising by Leigh Bardugo. This is the third book in the Grisha trilogy. I'm about halfway through, so I'll probably finish it this weekend. Yeah, I'm really enjoying it so far, and I'm looking forward to moving on to the rest of the Grishaverse, because I know a lot of people don't highly rate the original trilogy, but they really love sort of the later duologies. So I'm looking forward to moving on to those. I am really enjoying this trilogy, so I think hopefully Six of Crows is just going to be mind-blowing because of how much I already enjoy this, and that one's meant to be better, so I'm really looking forward to that. I've got that on request from the library, so hopefully that will come through soon and I'll get to read that one this month as well. But yeah, so I'm reading that one at the moment. I also started last month, but it's going to take me a while to get through. I've got An Interrupted Life, the Diaries of Etty Hillesum. So Etty Hillesum was a Dutch Jew during the Second World War, and she kept diaries and wrote letters about her experiences. It's meant to be really profound, really powerful, sort of a grown-up equivalent of the Diary of Anne Frank, but less well known. So I'm about 30 pages into this, but it's quite heavy, it's quite deep, so I can only read it in small doses. So I might not finish this month, but I'm hoping to get a little way through it. Sort of the other non-fiction book that I picked up at the moment, I'm going to try and do this bit without getting too emotional. There's a lot of inspiring Christian women out there who have done sort of really powerful work in fighting against the patriarchal society that is so prevalent in the church. And one of those amazing women is a lady called Rachel Held Evans, and a couple of weeks ago she had the flu and she was given antibiotics, and she had an allergic reaction to it, went into hospital, and we just heard over the weekend that she passed away. And it's very hard to take. And I'd not really read any of her books. I read her blog quite a few times, and when I was doing my AMA in theology, we talked about her writings, and I follow her on Twitter and just see the remarkable impact she's had, because she started out just speaking up for women in the church, but that grew to speak up for anyone that was marginalised in the church. So any minority groups, LGBTQ plus community, neurodiverse people, people with learning disabilities, people of colour. She was an advocate for all of them. So when I first heard that she was sick, I sort of was cross at myself that I hadn't actually read any of her books. So I bought this one, and this is called Inspired, which is about coming to terms with some of the more difficult aspects of the Bible, because there's some really brutal stuff in there, and sort of it's trying to weigh that up with a faith that promotes love. And then after she died, I've now bought, or I've ordered all of her other books, so I'm waiting for them to come, and I'm going to try and read them all, and I hope that I can be one of the many that are going to carry on her legacy. She was only 38. She has a young family, and it's just really hard to take. Like, she's not that much older than, or she wasn't that much older than I am. Yeah, I've only read a little bit of it so far, but it's just beautiful. Her writing is beautiful, and I'm just sad that I won't get to meet her in this life now. But I have faith that I believe I will meet her in the next life. So, enough of me crying. The last book that I'm currently reading that I really need to finish this month is Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. I started reading this in January. Again, I had a big hefty omnibus edition, and I bought this cute little edition when I was in Hay on Wye, so I really want to try and finish this one this month. Once I finish those, I haven't got that much planned, other than they've just announced the second round of the Disney read-along, can't remember, which is later this month, so I am going to be filming a separate TBR video for that, so I will be coming back to you with my TBR for that later in the month. That is hosted by Tiny Book Dragon, and I will link to her announcement video. So that was all the books I read in April and what I'm currently reading. So let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. And that's it for today, because this is already a really long video, so I will talk to you again soon. Bye!